Good morning. Hemshech Ayin Beis, volume 3. We finished the paragraph on page 1215. Okay. He's explaining ani Rishon, ani Achrin, vani Achrin, Rishon being Keser, Achrin being Malchus. That Malchus is the primary divine instrument for creation, the creative power. And the reason for that is because Malchus, unlike its the higher emotional faculties, the emotions and the intellect, the spheres, which are all in a state of kiruv, what does that mean? That they are revealers of, like in the faculties of the soul, they're revealers of the soul's powers. Whereas Malchus does not reveal anything. Malchus is just a state of exalted state. And the same thing is its impact on those around it. The emotions are in a state of gilui and pnimi in relation. That's what a relationship is. Chesed, Gvura, Teferes. Malchus is not an equal with its subjects. The Melech is higher and removed from his subjects. So Malchus indicates so-called on the uniqueness of the human being, like he said, different than animals. The human being has the Teva HaMemshola. Not about being an equal, not about a relationship. It's really about leadership and governance and being in an exalted state. On the other hand, the Midas are about a relationship. So they're both revealers of the soul's faculties, in contrast to Malchus, which is not, and their effect is also one that's kiruv. As such, they're not the right tools for creation. Creation requires a distance between the creator and the creation. And the reason that he said, the koyach nivda, like he said, the Yisavasem is loyev shalis ma midas al yenis. Because the midas al yenis as giluyim would not create. They can relate to something that's on their level. Yesh ma'ayin means there's a leap. There's a paradigm shift between the ayin and the yesh. And the midas is a relationship, like a teacher and a student. The teacher does not create the student. So there's a relationship. There's something in common. Whereas Malchus has that ability. Firstly, it's a leap from the etzem because it's nivdal from the etzem, like Malchus of Ein Sof. As much as God is relating to existence by envisioning existence, like we said, the Ratzon L'Melucha No Emlech, that he wants existence, but he's removed from existence. He wants it in a form of being a melech. And that's where the power of creation comes into play. Regarding the question, but on the other hand, we have learned earlier in Ayin Beis that the process of creation also requires applying yourself. It's not just that being removed, applying yourself. And that's where we're learning now in this new paragraph that we started yesterday. And that is the question that he asked, which is, doesn't it say Reishis bara? Reishis is Chochma, b'chuchmasa. Chochma is with Chochma he created existence. So how is that consistent to what we said before, that that it's coming from Malchus and not from Reishis, which is Chochma? So now he's going to explain how that comes into play in the process of creation. Briefly, we learned in Ayin Beis a number of times in Chassidus in general that a creation in general is a dual forces are necessary. On one hand, there has to be a distance because a creator is not just revealing himself. It's not oyer and moyer, the light coming from the sun. It's creating something yesh ma'ayin, something that's unlike its source. So that requires a distance, a nivdal, havdalah. On the other hand, it says koyach hapoel benifel, the power of the producer in the production, where God invests himself and invests divine energy into creation. But it's not a contradiction, they're both necessary. Because the fact is the creation has to feel both things. One is that you can relate to godliness within us, but at the same time, you also recognize that God is beyond us. So Malchus reveals the beyond, and the Giluyim reveal the closeness and the relationship, which we're going to be learning now in more detail in this context. So we learned the question, what's with Reishis? So he said, Ayin, and that's what we began learning. He goes back to Atzilus. That to understand this well, we have to understand the role of Atzilus. So what is the role of Atzilus? Atzilus is an interface. Remember, God created everything in a process, in a systematic way that we can understand. In other words, it's not just magic and some power of kol yachal that God can do anything he wants. So God created with a systematic way. Atzilus is the bridge, is the interface between the emanator, a maitzil, and Nivroim, the creation. Because the Tachlis HaKavana, this is what we're in the middle. I'll start from the Tachlis HaKavana. Though we read it already, I'll just go through it quickly again. Because the ultimate purpose of Ein Sofu Hisavas de Biyah. The Kavana is not to create Atzilus. God does not need a revelation of himself. The Kavana is something to create something that is outside, so to speak, that on its own does not feel the divine. Atzilus feels the divine. It's a divine world. It's a world of structure, but it's its entire consciousness is recognizing chesed, gvura, chochma, binah of godliness. So the kavanah is avos de biyah. Like he says in the parentheses, because the kavanah is there should be a dira b'tachtenim. Lias leis baruch dira b'tachtenim. Shar kavanah b'savos hams lias leis dira b'tachtenim. The kavanahs are nishlam. The elam is biyah dafke. That's fulfilled in biyah. Commission is boilil, become a duchtim, become a drushim. So even though in general we know tachtenim means tachten shein la matam emenu, which is in asiya itself, the lowest level, but in the contrast to Atzilus, he calls it all generally biyah, because that's all the world of creation. So bria, yitzir, asiya are all one part of the process of creation. In that itself, the kavanah is tachtenim, the lowest level in asiya. Agam. Okay, this is where we stopped actually. Okay, so what do we have now? We have the kavanas tachtenim, biyah, not Atzilus. Atzilus, however, serves as a bridge. And we're still going to go back to the process of creation. But first, he's explaining Atzilus, the role of Atzilus. So now he says, 1 second. So you're telling me that Atzilus is the interface. V'hagam de Keser de Atzilus u'rotzen proti lisavas Atzilus. And though we learned earlier that Keser of Atzilus is the specific desire for the creation of Atzilus. So you said that, so therefore the Kavanah is an Atzilus. The Keser of Atzilus says, Rotzen Prati, God wants Atzilus. So what do you mean by saying that the Kavanah is not Atzilus, the Kavanah is Biyah? So he says right away, he qualifies. So even though there is a Rotzen for Atzilus, but the desire for Atzilus is in order for it to be an interface to bring the Ikar Kavana is that it should come to Hisavas Biyah. In other words, it's not an end in itself, Atzilus. It's in order, there should be the creation of Biriya Yitzir Asiyah, like he says in Tanya chapter 36, She'ena Kavana B'Shvila Atzilus. The Kavana is not in order to create Atzilus. Hoyel Ulahem Yirida Me'er Panav Yizbarach. That's the language of the Alter Rebbe. He doesn't elaborate here. But it says that in the Tanya. In Tanya, there are two explanations in that word. But briefly, the explanation that's most relevant to us is, because what's the point? What does God need to create Atzilus? If you want godliness, the levels before Atzilus are higher. Atzilus would be a Yerida Me'er Panav Yizbarach. So you have to say that the Kavanah is not in Gilead Lakus and Atzilus, the Kavanah is in Tachtenim, where there's no Gilead Lakus, where there's no revelation. And Atzilus is necessary to help the lowest world to reveal godliness. So that's the point. So in other words, the Rotzen, the Keser, that desires Atzilus, the Ikar Kavana Bezeh, is in order for there to be Biyah. So it's an interesting twist, an interesting touch, that when you say God desires, for example, to build a house, you said the example. So there's a Rotzen Kloli, I want to have a home. Then there's a Rotzen Prati, I want to have this room and that room and another room. Let's say that the Rotzen of Atzilus, Keser of Atzilus, is to have the main room of the house is, let's say, the owner's personal study, or the king's personal inner sanctum in this palace, in this home. So he's saying that's not that the Rotzen is to build that part of the home, but the Kavanah is to make a home in the lowest of worlds. So just because there's a room that is so-called has that quality of like a Atzilus, that the Rotzen for it ultimately is for the whole Kavanah of what this home is, to make a home for the divine in Biyah, in Tachtenim. Okay. V'zeu shekosav, kol shechofetz Hashem osa, that everything God desires, He does. And what does that mean? We know that God can do whatever He wants. But the word chofetz Hashem, the b'chinas asiyah, osa, the level of Asiya, V'isavus hayesh, the level of Asiya, the lowest world, and the creation of the Yesh. This comes from the desire and will of God. So the pasuk is indicating it's not just God, everything God wants, He does, but the level of Asa, Hashem Asa, that the level of Asiya comes from the Ratzon. Because the Keser, the Ratzon of Erein Sof Baruch Hu B'isavas Hayesh Dafka. So even though there is a Keser in each world, Ak, Akudim, Atzilus, Bri, Yitzir, Asiya, but what is the purpose of the Ratzon? Why does He want Atzilus? Why does He want it all? He wants it because He wants the Savas Hayesh. So ultimately, the real Ratzon, the real ultimate purpose of the Dvar. But in order to create a Yesh, you need to have steps. It's like someone says, I'm building a house in order to make, and that home should become a place where my children can live and that they should recognize godliness and so on. And then you start building the home. The home has all kinds of rooms. There's a kitchen. There's a hallways. But is the Ratzon in the hallways? Is the Ratzon in the kitchen? Or the Ratzon is in the ultimate purpose of this whole home? But God created an entire structure. That's called Seder Ishtalshlus. Atzilus, higher than Atzilus. The kavanah and all of that is ultimately to make a dira b'tachtein. That's what he's saying right now. So it's true. You want to have that room. You want to have Atzilus, so you need to build it properly. You can't just skip it over and say, you know what, I don't really want Atzilus, I want the Yesh, so let me do a quick job and knock off Atzilus. No, you need to build it properly. In order to get into the kavanah, you need to have the whole structure. But the kavanah of it all, he says, the ratzon of it all is asa, is isavas hayesh dafke. Rak b'chdei sheyeh haratzon be'erech liyes b'bchinas mokel liyesh. Now, so then, what are all the how does it work with all these levels? He says, however, in order for that this ratzon should be commensurate to be a source for this yesh, because remember, the ratzon of Hashem is a very high level. Tachteinim is a very low level. That's ani rishon. That's ani achron. So you're talking about rishon and achron. So how do you get from the highest level of God's essential desire to actually having a yesh, which is what his kavanah is? In other words, that you should see a revealed ratzon for this yesh. In our souls, in our essence, we want to have a home. But that's in the essence of the soul. Same thing, Lamaila. In the divine essence, in the divine Erein Sof, before the Tzimtzum, there's a desire for a Dira B'Tachtein. Nesava Kodesh Baruch Hu Dira B'Tachtein, all the way in Atzilus. But that has not yet become an operative ratzon. That's a root of why there is a desire. But how does it become an operative one? It would be like you have a dream house in your mind. It could be, it's not even in your mind yet. It's in your essence of your soul. There comes a point at a certain age, you say, you know what, I'd like to have this dream palace, this mansion. But it's still a fantasy. It's still an abstract desire inside of you. You need to turn that desire into a plan, into a design. And you need to have a ratzon that relates to. Then you say, okay, I'm going to hire an architect, and I'm going to hire a contractor and engineers, etc. And that means that the ratzon is now becoming one that's going to actually relate to the building of the yesh. So it's not just an abstract ratzon in the deepest parts of your soul. You're turning it into an operative one that's becoming part of a process. Remember, we said Keser is above the process, but it's Rishon. It's the first step. But now you need it to become a process, which is going to be Reishis and Chochma and so on, as we're going to learn shortly, until it actually becomes something that actually creates this yesh. Because God didn't want to leap, as we spoke. God wants a process, a progressive system that we can relate to. How did it get from that abstract, deepest levels of Atzmus and Erein Sof? How did it get into an operation of an actual creation? She says, which means that you should actually see not just what's in your heart and soul, but you're articulating to the architect or to the contractor or to whoever is building for you. Here's my plan. Here's what I want. and it needs to be something that's revealed and commensurate to whatever it is that you're going to build. He says, the year be'erech li is bechinas mokel yesh, and it should be be'erech, not from a distance that God says, I want a world, and poof, here's an existence. He wanted it to be in a way that's an orderly progression. Be'erech li is bechinas mokel yesh. Al zehu amtsoy Atzilus. That, for this purpose, we need the interface. In other words, if we just be a rotzen, a keser, and a tachtenim, we would have no way of understanding and no way of seeing a process here. Atzilus is that interface where you bring in the plan and the design, and Atzilus is the place where the rotzen manifests in a design, which in turn will instruct the details of how you build Biyah and the creation all the way to the Yesh below. So he now explained the interface of Atzilus in a very more specific and interesting context. So this is the Amtsoy of Atzilus. And now he elaborates even more. I'll stop shortly for questions, but he elaborates. Because Keser alone, why can't it just be Keser and Yesh, or Keser and Biyah? What's this Atzilus? Because Ratzon itself, Keser itself, is it beyond Gili. Remember, we learned Rishon, not Reishis. It's an Akudah that has no shape, not like the Yud of Chochma. It's a Rotz, it's not, there's no Gili yet. It's Keser. It's like the supraconscious. It's a Ratzon, but it's not yet in our air pnimi, in a manifest way. It's higher than Gili. The Ima Yeshu b'chinas Ratzon l'savus, even though it is a desire for creation, it's still in a state of concealment. It would be like in your soul that you want to have a home. But it could be that the Ratzon is only sitting there, you're not even acting on it. No one else knows about it. It could even be, furthermore, it could be you don't even know about it yet, because it didn't yet become conscious. We're all born with certain things, like it says, Ein Adam B'loi Bayis, Ein Adam B'loi Isha. So there's a Ratzon Atzmi in each person to ultimately find a home and live in a home and have a wife, a spouse. But for years, even though you're born with that inherent wiring like that, it could take years till it gets revealed. So in other words, even though there is that, it's there. And he says here, even though it's a Ratzon L'Savus, it's still the Tachlis HaHelam, utterly concealed. Adayin, v'nikra stima de kol stimen. There's even a state that is called stima de kol stimen, the covering, the concealment of all concealment. Stima means like sosum, locked up or concealed or covered, hidden. The hidden state of all hidden states, not just hidden, the hidden within the hidden. Shesosum gam b'bchinas chochma ubina. So he explains, because chochma bina is also a state of concealment relative to the emotions. When you're thinking something in your mind consciously, no one yet knows about it. But here we're talking about stima de kol stima, that it's even concealed from the conscious mind. It's the superconscious state. And definitely and for sure, it's concealed completely from the level from biyah, bri yitzir asiyah. Ve'ena begeder rotzen goli. And it's not yet even in the domain of a revealed desire. I go back to what we learned in Tzadik Daled, Tafresh Tzadik Daled, about the deeper levels where it's only a consideration, a deliberation, till you come to a determination. The point being that it's still not a Ratzon Goli, it's in a state of super consciousness. L'savas hayesh. Ain't beged the Goli l'savas hayesh. Beged the Ratzon Goli, rather. It's not yet a revealed desire in the creation of this yesh. It would be like saying you have, again, the desire within the soul to have a home, but it's not yet become revealed in any form or shape. That's how it is in Keser. Is barely ill, and like we learned earlier, that even though Keser is the Rishon L'Netzalim, the first of the emanations, remember we learned the Ramak and the Arizal on the top of page 1214. Rishon L'Netzalim, but we also learned Harihu Muvdil Mehem, but it's separate from the Netzalim. So it's Keser, is the beginning of the emanations, the first of the emanations, but it's still in a state of being removed from them. So yes, it's lower than the source, but it's still above the actual other emanations. The kolshke mebiyah, it's even removed from Chochma Binah, or Chochma, Binah, and so on, and for sure that it's removed from Biyah. So then how do we move from there to next step? Like I said, it's missing a step. It would be like saying, I want to have a home inside my super consciousness, but you need a home. How does it get from there to an actual physical, to an actual structured home? So he says, this is where Atzilus comes in. Starting with Chochma of Atzilus. Va'idei ha'eses spheres d'Atzilus. Through the 10 spheres of Atzilus. Bo ha'rotzen memadrega lemadrega. That carries, the rotzen transmits or travels, bo, it arrives and travels, transmits from level to level, ad b'chinas Malchus d'Atzilus, till it reaches Malchus of Atzilus, the lowest level of Atzilus. Shu b'chinas rotzen gole li'savas biyah. That's the rotzen, the revealed rotzen for biyah. Because in Atzilus, even the higher levels, they are also preparing the ground. But Malchus is going to become the Keser of biyah. So Malchus now has become a rotzen where a specific desire is defined to build this particular type of home. Whereas in Keser of Atzilus, it's still in a state of an amorphous state and may not even revealed. In Malchus of Atzilus, on the other hand, after going through the spheres of Atzilus, which is the contemplation and the design created by the mind, Chochma Binah we'll learn shortly, then developed in the midas, the emotions that create a relationship with it is what you want to build. That will, which is all kiruv, then it will come to Malchus, the koyach nivdal that we talked about, and we'll get back to that soon as well. And then here it's now a rotzen goli, a very specific desire for this particular type of home, which is going to be biyah, which will ultimately savas hayesh, which is the ultimate purpose of all of these ritzenis, all these desires, kavana to make a dira b'tachtein. Shubchinis rotzen goyel l'savas biyah ube'erech lies b'chinis mokalehem, and it's now commensurate to being a mocker. It's still a melech, but it's now a mocker because it's moved away from the way it is in the source, in Keser, and higher than Keser and all the spheres. It's now come to the point where it's going to be able to create. It's still going to be above the creation. Like we said, it's still superior, a melech, it's nasus, but it's now a melech ala'am. It's a melech that's going to relate to its nation, to its creation. Okay, so the topic is not finished. It's now going to go to Chochma and Reishis. But in case anybody has any questions till now, what I've learned right now about Atzilus and its role in context of Keser and Malchus. So you see now how this is all coming together. Dani Rishon, everything we learned about Keser, Rishon, and Malchus, and the creation, now he's discussing it in coming together in the real process of how it all together works at building existence as we know it. But if anybody has any questions on what we just learned, please go ahead. And if not, I'll just continue. Okay. So he continues now like this. The Reishis is galus harotzen. So now, to break it down further, you told me the Keser alone is a superconscious state, meaning it's not revealed. Malchus is where it becomes a manifest rotzen, directly ready to build biyah. Well, what's in between? You said you need the essence spheres of Atzilus, but what happens? So you're going to now explain. It says, Reishis, the word Reishis, you see, is galus, harotzen. Where does the rotzen first begin to emerge in a conscious way? What's the first? Reishis is galus, the first step from the superconscious hidden state to a conscious state. Hu b'chinas Chochma. That's Chochma. That's the level of Chochma, the first of the 10 spheres. Shenikra Reishis. Or Shenikra Reishis, it's called Reishis. Remember, Chochma Reishis. Reishis, b'chuchmasa. On page 1213, Reishis Chochma. So that's the level of Reishis. Shehi b'chinas mekabel merishin. That's the makabel from Rishon. Remember we said Reishis is Lashon Nekeva makabel. Rishon is Lashon Zocher mashpia. So even though it's called Reishis also, but it's the makabel like within the mashpia. So the makabel of the Rishon, the first recipient and receptacle and container that receives, the first student, if you wish, of Keser is Chochma, which receives from Rishon Keser. V'hainu. And why is that the case? Why is Chochma this level? Because Chochma is going to say is the level of V'hainu mepnei she'Chochma ma'ayin timotza. And that is due because Chochma ma'ayin timotza. So the verse means Chochma, from where does it come? But Chassidus teaches ma'ayin, not a question from where does it come, from whence does it come? It's a statement. Chochma, where does it come from? Ma'ayin, from Ayin. What's Ayin? He says, Mepchinas Ayin de Keser. Remember we said Ani Rishon is the letter Ani is Ayin. The bittul of Keser. From the Ayin of Keser, that's where Chochma Timotza emerges from, is derived from. The Reishis Hagili, Ma'atzmus Helem HaKeser. It's the first speck, the first glimmer of light, of revelation from the core concealment of Keser. So in simple psychological terms, the first place where consciousness emerges, the birth of conscious thinking, is rooted in the superconscious of Keser. So when you have a spark of an idea, and you don't know exactly where it came from, but you sense it came from somewhere, that somewhere is the Ayin of Keser, or specifically the Ayin of the Koyach HaMaskil, Chochma Stima. These are all words that are applicable here, even though he doesn't use those words here. That's where it's rooted, but it's in a state of Ayin there. It's not revealed. Consciousness means I am now aware and conscious of this stream that has begun as a spark called Chochma Ma'ayin Timotza. So Chochma is the first revelation of the concealed desire as it's in the superconsciousness of Keser. Reishis Hagilui. And this is the meaning Bereishis bara. Going back to the beginning of the paragraph. Remember, he asked the question, does it come from Malchus? Does it come from Chochma? Bereishis bara Lakim is Bereishis bechuchmasa. So he says, this is the meaning Bereishis bara Lakim. Bereishis. The B'chinas Chochma is Reishis. The B'chinas Chochma, who B'chinas is Galus Arotzim, B'chinas HaKeser. So there's a Keser, Arotzim, Helam, Nelam, that God has. When the Torah begins, Bereishis bara, it's basically the first conscious expression of that Rotzim that God had that precedes the Bereishis, the Rishon. And Bereishis is receiving from that superconscious. Bereishis bara, the first verse in the Torah, is already a conscious experience. That Reishis is creating because it's the first step outside of the Rishon of Keser. So he says, Bereishis bara, the B'chinas Chochma, B'chinas is Galus HaRotzim, B'chinas HaKeser, is the revelation of the desire from the level of Keser that is beyond revelation. The Kamoisha Bo B'chinas Chochma, Harizeh B'chinas Reishis. So now, what happened? Now that the super consciousness that's concealed came into a state of Gili and consciousness in Reishis Chochma, so now he says, this is the Reishis sheyesh le'shaychus leb'chinas achris, shu b'chinas Malchus. Remember, we said that Rishon is moved, is removed. Bereishis, Rashi says that he quotes on page 1213 that in l'cha Reishis b'mikra she'ena davuk l'teva shel achra. As soon as you say Reishis, it's still the beginning, but it's now a beginning that leads and is connected with and leads us directly into the process. So Keser is removed. It's Rishon, but removed. Chochma Reishis is already now Bereishis bara Elikim, it's a Shamayim v'Sa'aretz, and it leads all the way to Malchus. So it's now the beginning of the process that will conclude with Malchus. Keser is removed from that. Chochma Reishis, Bereishis, he says, is now Shaychus. He says, Sheyesh le'shaychus leb'chinas achris. The truth is, there's a shaychus to all the levels below it, but also to the last level, So that, which is the level of Malchus of Atzilus, the last of the 10 spheres. So now he's literally tying together the last few pages into a whole picture here of how creation comes into being, from the most abstract superconscious states, all the way to the beginning of consciousness of it, all the way to the end of Malchus, where it's a Ratzon Goli, ready to create Biyah, which is the ultimate Kavanah. So what he's done is dissected Atzilus into parts. Keser, Chochma, Malchus. Chochma, of course, being the beginning of the spheres, which we'll soon talk about. But bottom line is, this is the process, and the truth is, this is the process that all of us go through. In a healthy person who's planning anything, it all begins with a superconscious desire, which then turns into a conscious spark, which then is developed in Binah, and through the Midas you begin to relate to it personally, subjectively, relationship with it, Avir, and so on, until Malchus, and you're ready to go build, and actually build whatever it is that you are intending to do. So Atzilus is the engine room, if you wish, of where all this is taking place, and is traveling from the deeper, the higher abstract levels to the more tangible, concrete levels. Yeah. Again, any questions? Okay. Umakol mokim, and nevertheless, now he's going to say, it's true. Chochma is revelation compared to Keser, conscious compared to superconscious. But
Rabbi, I have a question.
Yeah.
You mentioned that the superconscious is coming, I guess, of the divine consciousness is Keser. As you relate it to the human being, we would understand the superconsciousness to be the Yechida. So is that to say the source of the Yechida is Keser?
I wouldn't use the word Yechida here. Since he doesn't use it, I wouldn't use that here.
Okay. I was trying to relate to your use of the term superconscious.
Well, I think superconscious is more English than Yechida is. So
okay.
There's Yechida, there's Chaya, there's levels of the soul. You're talking about the 5 levels of the soul: Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, Chaya,
Correct.
Yechida?
Yes.
Are you asking me how that's associated here?
Essentially, I'm asking what's the root of it, because you're talking about the superconsciousness of the divine construct, contemplative process, or the ruchnius that is driving.
In Kabbalistic terms, the word is Keser. That's the word Keser. That's the word that's used. If you want to make an association of Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, Chaya, Yechida, I could do that, but it's not the language he's using here. Here's the word Keser would be the right word.
Right. That
if
was
you're
my
looking
question.
for a word.
That's what I'm looking for.
Rabbi Jacobson.
Keser is the word that Keser, Chochma, Malchus. Keser being the superconscious source of it all in this state. You asked me to explain superconsciousness. What do I mean by that?
No, you answered my question.
Okay.
Does that also mean that the source of our Yechida is in the Keser of?
It's another discussion. I don't want to go there right now. It's not really. It's not part of this discussion here. I would reserve that after we finish the topic. We can go over and discuss that. I'd rather not do that now.
Okay.
The Rebbe says here that Reishis is a makabel, Rishon is a mashpia. When it says Bereshis, bara Elokim, I've always understood that we use the term bara only creating from biyah, from Atzilus to biyah. Is there another creation that's going on here from Keser into Chochma that would be called Bereshis bara? There is Reishis being created, Chochma being created by Keser, so to speak, or you don't really look at it that way?
No, I wouldn't say that. The way the Targum says, "B'chochma sebara Elokim es hashamayim v'saaretz." God created the world with Reishis. In other words, when he asked the question on the top of the paragraph, he said, "You're telling me creation comes from the level of Malchus, but the pasuk says it comes from the level of Chochma. With wisdom, with Chochma, God created Shemayim v'aretz. The pasuk still is talking about the creation of heaven and earth, which includes all creation. So it's not talking about the creation of Chochma here. It's on the contrary. Chochma is the Reishis that creates all of existence. So here he's explaining how that's reconciled with Malchus by saying, Reishis, how does Chochma get this? Where is it coming from? It's coming from Rishon, which is beyond Reishis. Keser. Keser informs Reishis. Bereishis, with the Chochma, is the creation of Hashemayim v'Sa'aretz. The topic is not finished. He's still going to explain the pasuk more in detail. So I would just wait till we finish this paragraph. You'll see more details that will make it clear. Okay. So now he's going to qualify. Fine. Chochma's Reishis compared to Keser, as he explained, like the makabel within the mashpia. In other words, it's already associating and the beginning of the actual process. Says umekol mokem, because then you could say, so why not just have Keser, Chochma, Malchus? Why do we need Binah through Yesod? So he says the following: umekol mokem b'Chochma hu b'bchinas pshitas adayin. As much as Chochma is a conscious state relative to the superconscious concealed state, a conscious revealed state compared to the superconscious concealed state of Keser, but it's still pshitas adayin. Relatively, it's still shapeless. Remember, it's a yud, so it's more than just a dot that has no shape. The yud has a top, a bottom, and a middle, but it's still the letter yud. It's still essentially just a point. And it becomes more defined or more shaped. It's tire literally means shaped. Like a seer, like when the artist begins to paint, he begins with a point. He makes a point, and then he begins to shape it and define it. He doesn't just make an outline. He's the mitzvah yeser and Binah. If you recall before, he used the expression apirion on page 1213. He said in the Maimer Achas She'alti that Chochma is like the color white, which is still white is still colorless, and on that level white you have the apirion. You call it Shiurim. All the shapes that come from Binah are made on the color white. So anything you draw, a map or anything, is with the backdrop of the white Chochma. And Binah, it's mitzayeres yeser. That's an expression from Kabbalah. He's going to quote it now. It becomes more shaped. So essentially, Chochma is the initial spark, the initial yud, the initial consciousness. So something is revealed. It's moved from concealed and superconscious to conscious, but it's still not developed. It's not fleshed out. And to build a house and to build biyah and a yesh, you need a fleshing out. Chochma is not enough. So that's why he says Chochma is still in a state of pshita, shapelessness. U'mitzvah yesher b'chinas Binah. Shezeu Ayin kulam b'Chochma asisa Binah. The pasuk continues. You've created everything with Chochma, like he said before. That comes from Chochma, the asisa. But then it goes on Binah. U'kamoishin is barely il dibra maschel achas sha'alti. He quoted this mimer already earlier on page 1213. Like we learned, that was discussed earlier in the mimer achas sha'alti, which is in volume 2, page 1116. So what did he say there? Ukanal. Ukanal meaning, as we just learned before, 2 pages back, 1213. So you see now how the development of the structure, going back to the example of building a house, there's the concealed superconscious desire within the soul for a home. Then it begins to emerge in a conscious Chochma. But now it needs to develop. And that's what Binah does. Binah develops the spark of the idea that's conceived in Chochma, as we know. Okay, now he's going to quote from Pelech HaRiman. You may remember Pelech HaRiman from the Rameh, Mipane, which is a commentary on the Pardes of the Ramak. This was quoted earlier. I'm looking where? Just a few pages back, Pelech HaRiman. Okay. It wasn't the same quote anyway, but I'm just curious, where did it say this? Anybody remember? Maybe it was more than a few pages. I don't know. Okay, fine. So Pelach Hariman, which is from the Rameh Mipanesh, Shar Gimel Perik Beis, the third gate, chapter 2, Hevi B'Shem HaZeyar. He cites in the name of the Zohar, Reishis. And Zohar Reishis says the following: Gilufei Aglif Ahu Stimor Kadisha. That holy secret place, Keser, there, Gilufei Aglif, that level engraved. Gilufei comes from the word chekike, chokak chekike. It's like saying engraved and engraving. So the way, so even though the actual reading should be engrave and engraving, that holy hidden level called Keser. So Keser, basically engraved and engraving, Gav Moi Dechad Timira, through the inner of that one concealed state, which is Das Sheba Chochma. He's spelling out what levels. I'll explain in a moment. Let me just read it. The Nokid B'Nekuda, which then Nokid B'Nekuda made a point. He pointed a point. The Noitz is a, I think Noitz means here Noitz B'Sofa B'Tchalesa means wedged. I think the Noitz here means B'Nekuda Noitz. I think it means not sharp, just I think a pointed state. I'm not sure. I want to look up what the Noitz means. So essentially, the Pelach Hariman brings from Zohar that there's a process here. The hidden Stimar Kadisha is Keser. It's called the holy hidden state. There was engraved something that traveled through the concealed state of Das of Chochma, the Nokid B'Nekuda the Noitz. And he explains, V'hainu hamshocha ma'keser la'chochma. So this is referring to Keser going into Chochma, and what does means the Nekuda? Because of God Moed the Chatamir through the Chiachatmir, because of the Chochma Nekuda the Noitz. Noitz means looks like Dovuk maybe.
Keser the Chochma, no?
It says Das Sheba Chochma. Where do you say Keser Sheba Chochma?
Keser the Chochma Nekuda the Noitz.
Oh, maybe. Yeah, 1 second. Let me see. Lav Dafke. You could also see the Kosav, the Nekuda. Let me read it. It could be the Keser the Chochma. Maybe. I'm not sure. I don't think so, but maybe. I thought it meant that he's referring that he writes that Chochma is called Nekuda the Noitz, and he's explained the Liyese. So let's explain what Nekuda Noitz is, and I'll go back to this in a minute. Liyese Dovuk Pamadrege Shachreha. So Noitz actually Noitz means that it is wedged. That Nokib and Nekuda the noise that it makes a point, the noise that is expressed or relates to.
It's not
what?
It's not the Keser.
I know. I thought so. Yeah. The Kosav, the Chochma Nikim Nekuda noise, the noise li is Davuk bit Amadrege Shachrel. Means it's connected to the levels afterward. Mashenken Keser itself, page 1216. Where the Keser itself, Nikan Nekuda Deloy Noitz, Mipnei She'ena Davuk Kanal. So the Keser is also a Nekuda, we learned, but it's like a point that doesn't even have any shape. So Chochma is a point that has shape and relates to the levels afterwards, whereas Keser itself is a Nekuda that's not connected with and relates and attached to the levels afterwards. So to go back for a moment.
No, it's stuck in, which means that it is a hamshacha.
Yeah, correct. So in other words, Keser, Stimar Kadisha, is a state that is beyond, it in turn engraves something in this level of Chochma, where it becomes a Nakuda that's wedged in the levels afterwards. So in other words, to put it in simple terms, think of an artist. An artist has a desire and a plan and a desire in his mind to draw art. That's Keser. It's still concealed in his desire. The desire then engraves something in the Chochma, which is now going to turn into a point that's translating his desire in his Ratzon into a specific point on the paper, which that point can now begin being extended into a full-shaped idea, a full-shaped image. So Chochma is already, on one hand, it's not just in his desire anymore, it's already a point. But on the other hand, it's a point that is still shapeless, but it's existent, and that point will then be shaped by Binah into details.
He said, Das shebechochma.
That's the level that the Pelech HaRiman associates. In Chochma itself, clearly, Chat Tamira is Das shebechochma. Then Nokin Nukud is probably the rest of Chochma. That's just he's adding, just telling us in Chochma itself, what step in Chochma is this Moi Gav Moi Dechat Tamira.
It goes in me'oi means me'ayim, intestines, right? Intestines.
Like may I, like insides, yeah.
Me'ayim. Me'ay.
Now, I don't know, you mean like Chochma Ma'ayin Timotza?
No. Me'ayim, like the intestines.
Yeah, Ma'ayin, like the stomach, the innards. Me'ay here definitely means like Me'imoy, the inner dimension.
Yeah, this is Dash of Chochma, he said.
Yeah. The Nokid, B'Nekuda denotes. So bottom line, I just explained it in a very simple way. Let's not be too abstract or else it's going to be very hard to understand. The desire translates into engraving something through the Nekuda, through the inner dimension of Chochma, becomes a Nekuda on the page that then can be shaped into more details. Like he says the next line, Umina Chochma, line 2 on page 1216, Umina Chochma mitztayer bebina. And from Chochma it gets mitztayer, shaped and defined in Binah, sheba yeser bebchinas galus. That makes it come even more revealed. Chochma is already a first revelation in contrast to Keser. And Binah becomes even more revealed and more expressed. Okay.
So the Chochma is Nekuda de Noitz, and Keser is Nekuda de Loi Noitz.
Yeah. Ubagdomas HaZayar, 1 second, maybe, you know what, I'm going to stop here. Because the Agdama HaZayar is now going to explain how all this is indicated in the Pasuk Reishis Bara Lekimas HaShamayim V'Saaretz. That verse tells us all these levels. But because it's going to be a little more detailed explanation, I'll do it tomorrow. But the Agdam of the Zayar, Dav Beis Amar Aleph, talks about how this all becomes a process of creation. So to sum up, essentially he's explaining the process of creation, how it happens from the higher levels through the lower. Atzilus serves as that interface. Chochma is the beginning of the process, Reishis, that receives from Rishon, which is above the process, but a step above Rishon, the superconscious concealed state. Chochma, then it travels into Binah, where it develops into more shape and form. And then it continues until it will get to Malchus, and Malchus will take it all and create Biyah, the ultimate Kavana Tachtenim, all the way to Asiyah Gashmis and Tachtenim. That's essentially, in sum, what he's saying here. One second. That's a summation, essentially, of what he's saying here. And that's going to bring us back to Ani Rishon and Ani Achrin. And we still have to get back to Gan Eden and other things, but there's a few more pages, 1, 2, 3 more pages until he gets back to Gan Eden. But that sums up what we learned right now. Anybody has any questions?
Oh, you said here, it's called Reishis, Shieshli Shaychus, with Kenas Achris, which is Kenas Malchus.
Yeah.
There is Reishis and Achris.
Yeah. So, any questions?
Keser? Is Rishon Keser? This is Reishis Chochma.
Yeah, of course. Rishon is Keser and Reishis is Chochma, yeah.
I have a question about this. So we were talking about Atzilus gives down to Chochma, but now he's saying Keser is what create. There's an engraving. Keser causes an engraving, which yields Chochma. So what happened to Atzilus in this whole schema?
What do you mean? Atzilus is where all this is happening. It's Keser of
Okay.
Atzilus, Chochma of Atzilus, Binah of Atzilus, Malchus of Atzilus.
Uh-huh.
These are all levels in Atzilus.
Okay. And the other question is, what is there a mechanism? Like, it just seems like here it's saying, quoting from the Kabbalah, it just sort of happens. There's an engraving, but typically we've been learning in terms of like interface, like conduits from one level to the next. And this seems almost like the Eibishter, carving out the commandments with his finger, just doing it. I mean, as opposed to some kind of conduit or chain or membrane or parsa or some mamutza. In this instance, and Dafka, it seems like it's intentionally that way, because you're saying it's separate from, has to be separate from.
This is the process. This exactly is the process. Keser to Chochma is a process. Like the superconscious to the conscious mind is a process. Chochma to Binah is a process. This exactly is a very logical, structured process. You don't need anything more. That's exactly, a person has a spark of a conceived idea, and then he fleshes it out. There's no leaps here at all. These are all very gradations in a Sheder Shtalshus that are very structured and organized.
I hear that. I'm trying to drill down even more granularly in terms of this idea of engraving.
Engraving is simply it's part of the. It's just like you have a general concept. You want to have a home, and then you begin to imagine and engrave the image of what that home is going to look like.
Okay.
It's called envisioning. It's called envisioning. Like someone says, "What's your idea?" You say the idea, then you start envisioning the details, and then you begin to put it down in a kuda, which will then shape into a binah.
So engraving, you could say envisioning, for the sake of bepashtus, for simple terms.
This is all spiritual levels. There's no physical chiseling of rocks and stones here.
This
is all spiritual levels of, like we said, Goliv, Galifu, B'Tihiri Allah. These are all just using the Torah Dibra B'Loshem B'nei Adam. The Torah uses language of human being, of our language, just to give us a way of being able to talk about it. These are all spiritual levels of how things are going from a shapeless state to a more shaped state.
Yes, of course. That's a given. I was just saying, when you say, when the Kabbalah says engraving, you're using a synonym, envisioning, to make it perhaps more understandable in this ethereal
because we're not
sense.
talking about physical engraving. There's no physical engraving. That's a given. Once you know that's not a physical engraving, you understand it as being basically from shapelessness coming to shape. It's a process. Like anything is a process. And we humans do it all the time. You begin with something that's more or less shaped until you start fleshing it out and shaping it.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
This is not Pelach HaRimayin from Reb Hillel, right?
This is Pelach HaRimayin from Rameh Mipanoi. I mentioned that. Rameh Mipanoi. Okay, we stop here on the top of page.
He was a Talmud of the Arizal?
Rameh Mipanoi, I already discussed this. He wrote commentary on Ramak. He was an Italian Kabbalist. No, he was not a Talmud of the Arizal. He never met the Arizal. He was a Talmud of Talmidim of the Arizal. Okay, we stop here, top of page 12.